Hello, welcome to the University of Nebraska Omaha's Required Reading, a program that showcases UNO authors and their works. I'm Michael Hilt. On today's program, we'll examine offerings from two UNO authors. First, Todd Robinson has been a member of the UNO Writers Workshop faculty for 9 years. Today he shares some insight into his new book of poetry, Note at Heart Rock. From Twitter and Facebook to YouTube and Vine, Jeremy Lipschultz has studied social media. In his book, Social Media Communication, Concepts, Practices, Data, Law, and Ethics, Jeremy presents a wide-scale, interdisciplinary analysis and guide to social media. Now let's hear from Todd Robinson and more about his book, Note at Heart Rock.
Todd Robinson has taught in UNO's Writers Workshop for 9 years and was named Outstanding Faculty Member by the Thompson Learning Community for the 2011-2012 season. He has a PhD from UNL and has been involved in community literary groups, the Stephen Doctors Project, and the Nebraska Writers Collective. His poems and book reviews have appeared in Sugar House Review, Margie, Southeast Review, the Midwest Quarterly, Prairie Schooner, the Lincoln Journal-Star, Nature Bridge, and Burnt District, among others.
Hi, Todd. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, great to be here.
We're going to talk about your first collection of poetry, Note at Heart Rock. But for me to introduce you as a poet and a teacher is kind of like introducing Mick Jagger as a guitarist with a band. There's a personality phenomenon, a larger-than-life quality that has to be addressed if I'm introducing Todd Robinson. I want to describe what it is to encounter you, let's say walking across campus, and it's a better walk across campus when we run into you, or it's a better night in town when we run into you. It's to be greeted by this improvisation of wordplay, poetic language, arcane vocabulary, literary references. If someone were watching, they'd say that man's an actor. But no. You are, like the rest of us surly, socially inept writers, a person who sits in his room alone and puts words down on paper or on a screen. So, how does this excellent extrovert coexist with the sensitive soul who wrote this beautiful book of poetry?
First of all, I just want to bow before that beautiful stream of verbiage. I could not match nor top that. That was truly humbling.
You can, and you have, and you will today.
This is just great. Great to be here. You know, one thing that you said was how I am this sort of bright light when I meet people, but I feel that people are the bright light, that every single person is a sort of exposed wire. You know, when I'm in contact with them, I just feel brighter, bigger, smarter, truer. So it's not performative. It's not a desire to sort of sing and dance. I just am delighted, you know, when I see a student on campus, when I see you, when I see anyone, strangers, friends, former students, I'm just happy to see them. But on the other hand, if I see no one and no one sees me, I'm beeline to my office, head down, pensive. So no one is always Mick Jagger. You know, even Mick has got to just cry into his waffles once in a while, you know. As for the sort of more pertinent question, you're right. You know, writing is a solitary, maybe even hermetic kind of an occupation. And sometimes I lose sight of the discipline, the dedication it requires to sit down in the chill of the morning and swing the hammer, you know. I'm really mixing my metaphors here, but so how do they coexist? I suppose they coexist. Ezra Pound said artists are the antenna of the race. So when I'm about town, when I'm throwing out the first pitch, when I'm here on campus, I'm just gleaning data from all of you, your voices, your clothing, your values, you know, your problems, and I collect all that pollen and I go back to the beehive, right? And I, whatever bees do, I think they spit it up, right? And I suppose that's what I do. Yeah. Yeah,
you're such a great observer. When you're looking out at that classroom of maybe 18, 19-year-olds, and you see it clicking for one or two or three or four, what's happening? And maybe you remember it from when it happened to you, but maybe from observing them, what's happening inside of them?
Yeah, in some way it mimics that experience of really being immersed in a poem. It's a moment of pure concentration. It's this kind of golden cone of focus. We have just read a poem or discussed a story, or we're talking about, I don't know, someone's childhood. We might push a little bit away from the page, but whatever it is, we're in that moment. No one's looking at a cell phone. No one's looking in their calendar to figure out when to attend a meeting. We have 3 or 4, or ideally 14 or 15 wills sort of bent to a single purpose. And as you know from teaching, that's about as exalted a state as you can have. It feels like, we're all rowing a galleon through the seas towards some golden shore. Maybe I'm overstating all this preposterously, but yeah, that's the feeling that we're one, that we have a singular purpose, and we're being enlarged. We're being improved by that. Just briefly, maybe. Maybe it's tenuous, but something good is happening.
I'm thinking of your poem in here, Egg. Simple poem. It's a beautiful poem in its simplicity. And when I read it, it reminded me of an exercise we might give the students in autobiographical reading and writing. Find a moment in your life from your past, your youth, whatever, and write it down, and then let's explore it to see what's happening under the surface of that. Is that kind of what happened with that poem, Egg? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. That memory has kind of haunted me my whole life. My cousin and I spent summers on a farm, and she would always take me into the chicken coop. Sometimes we'd harvest eggs for breakfast. Mostly we were just kind of bored, and there was nothing to do. It was early '80s, northeast Nebraska, man. The options were slim, for entertainment, and I don't even remember who suggested it, but I wanted to throw these eggs, but we were afraid there were chicks in them, right? And she said, no, if you look at them like I know how to look at them, I grew up on a farm, you can tell which ones are fertilized, and so these eggs here are unfertilized, right? These are the eggs you would eat, so we can throw these, it's fine. And so out we go in this kind of big open gravel area, and we start throwing eggs, and threw 3 or 4 or 5 of them. And it was great fun, and then we went to kind of look at the sort of ground zero, what have you, and one of them there was a little chick in there, and I was, I think writers, I think human beings in general, we're sympathetic people. We can always sort of have that postmodern perspective and inhabit the place of another being, human or not, and it was just this tragic image, this little chick dead, and I had killed it, I threw the egg, and so, it really bothered me for years and years. Most people would probably, I guess, say that's absurd, it's just one little moment, it was an accident, it didn't even matter, but it mattered, it was brutal. So, it just kind of haunted me, and that's one part of where the poems come from. Those memories, as you said, the way we try to incite students to write. I've got to sort of puzzle this out. I've got to make sense of it. I've got to sort of see through it to its bottom, whatever that is. And that was one of those poems that really came out in one singular sort of push. Let's just recreate this sort of accurately, but lyrically, get into the moment and try to convey the horror. The end was the only part that was kind of tricky. I had this super self-conscious ending for a long time, really repetitive, and I thought it was super cool. I'd actually stolen it from another poet, and from Joel Peckham. I don't know if you know him; he's a fantastic writer. But that wasn't the real voice. That wasn't the real ending, and so it just kind of. It's still a brutal ending, but it's more true to the experience. It's sort of what happened rather than this, layering on of artifice that it had been.
Well, what sticks with me is that ending of the open eye looking up at you with accusation, maybe even some compassion, but I'll never forget the moment of the ending of that poem. It so beautifully sums up the universal experience of damage done that was unintended. So it's a simple and beautiful poem. Can you talk about another poem in the collection and maybe the process of how it came to be?
Yeah, sure. You know, the process to me is still pretty mysterious. You know, Wordsworth said we murder to dissect, and so sometimes I get a little nervous about getting too close to that process, you know. And it varies. I mean, sometimes it's 6 in the morning, can't sleep, and this is the only way to sort of make use of that, you know. Before the logical brain has booted itself into life, we just sort of want to pour the miasma of the self out. Sometimes it's very deliberate. I need to write a poem, and this memory makes me angry or happy, and I want to do justice to it. And sometimes it's really kind of absurd, and a poem from the book that maybe speaks to your question, there's a poem in here, Tulum. It's about this kind of hippie Mexican community and a Mayan ruin that my wife and I visited many years ago, and I was really struck by the contrast of this ancient seaside cliff that really felt sort of glorious, you know, wreathed in history and time, all these references and gods and frescoes that we couldn't really make sense of, and then just sort of schmuck tourists like me, you know, walking around. And I thought that contrast between this sort of ancient peoples and these modern sort of pasty, you know, middle-class people poking around amongst it, I felt like something sacred had been profaned, and I couldn't quite figure out how to write about it. I tried, and I didn't really maybe have the right point of view. And one day, while I was in the Seven Doctors Project, I had a poem due the next day. My wife and I were watching TV. I mean, there's no glamour or sex appeal to this story at all. Poetry really isn't glamorous, probably. So I needed to write this poem. I just went and grabbed this really sort of trashy book of folk mythology that I have called Deities and Demigods. And there was a section on Central American gods. And I just started leafing through it. TV show's on. My wife's watching TV. I've got my notebook here. And they've got these incredibly rich names, these gods, like Kamazots and Shachipili, and you know, you'd see these little drawings of frescoes and bird gods and snake gods, Coatl, you know, and the sounds and the sense of history and the sort of astral, you know, reach and depth, you know, yoked to these my memory of these kind of crumbling buildings and the sea. And I thought that's really it, you know, the sense that all this was built to exalt these things that are no longer remembered, that are just barely tenuously part of our inheritance. And so that kind of became the poem, you know, just kind of linking each stanza to a different god, the god of bats, the god of snakes, the god of mystery, the god of human sacrifice, and just kind of yoking that to some really profane human thing, you know, cameras and people diving off the cliff and sandals and so forth, and to me that really strikes at what I think my poetry, maybe all poetry, is trying to do. It's trying to find the sacred in the profane, or it's trying to profane the sacred. It's trying to find the earthy sort of human musk on these like big abstract kind of glorious ideas, you know.
Todd, would you read a poem for us from the collection?
Sure.
Thank you.
I think somebody very dear to me requested that I read this one, so it's near the back of the book. I don't think it probably needs much introduction. I think it's fairly clear. I guess I'll just sort of launch into it. Near Assumption, Nebraska, the day went silver. It could have been wind or the shapes of cranes, the ditch green and cluttered, and my life gone out of sight. I lifted as if birds were children. I stood in brush and saw the cluster and squawk, the strange purposes of cranes. It was near Assumption, car long as a hearse, idling on the gravel road. Women mourned in the gray machine, and birds beat the sky. Sandburrs dimpled my legs, spiked as blurry stars. I stood still and watched cranes trill, long birds landing in shaved corn, the liquid light of afternoon, the stroke of waves upon miles of wheat. the travel of seasons, the toll of grief, my urge to hear or remember released.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for this great conversation,
An honor and a pleasure.
which has been as fun as all our conversations.
Hear, hear.
Note at Heart Rock can be purchased locally at the Bookworm, James Health Market, or from the publisher's website. Jeremy Harris Lipschultz is Isaacson Professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He served for a decade as director of the award-winning School of Communication. Lipschultz is Ethics Chair for PRSA Nebraska. He blogs media for the Huffington Post and contributes to Chicago Now. Lipschultz leads a team of interdisciplinary scholars in development of the UNO Social Media Lab in the Barbara White's Community Engagement Center.
Jeremy Lipschultz is a colleague of mine in the School of Communication. Thanks for joining us on the program. And I guess full disclosure, Jeremy was on the search committee those many years ago that invited me to join the faculty. So we have a long history. And you were a very early adopter of social media. I mean, I watched you from the very beginning. You really grabbed onto this 10, 12 years ago.
It really goes back to about 1977 and 78. I was at University of Illinois where I was doing my undergraduate degree, and they were connected to what I now understand and can label as the ARPANET, the predecessor of the internet. But at the time, I really didn't know what was happening, but these terminals were popping up. So I suppose I've been chasing that ever since.
What was attractive to you about that?
I think the forward-looking nature of technology and the direction that digital has taken us, I think it was early on fairly obvious that this was going to shift culture in many ways. So, you know, in those early days, newspapers like our student newspaper were putting in a new front-end system, they called it in those days. And these were terminals, dumb terminals connected to large mainframe computers. And I had the opportunity to work with some survey data from the University of Michigan and do some early statistical analysis using a big mainframe computer and punch data cards. And I found it very fascinating. It was 1976 election data, and this is about 1978. And there were a few media questions that they were asking in those days.
You and I were at a conference here at UNO, the 10-10-10 conference, which amazingly, 4.5 years ago now. It just doesn't seem that long ago. And I remember a session in which you weren't on the panel, and I forget who was, but you threw out, it was almost it wasn't a throwaway line, but it was just kind of an added comment, and you said, tweeting is reporting. And I remember thinking in my head, I disagree entirely with that, and I was thinking tweeting is misreporting, which it has been. But I'm wondering yes, it can be. But I'm wondering if you still hold to that thought that tweeting is reporting.
Well, there's a context to that comment. We were interviewing David Matheson via Skype, I think, and David and I had interactions probably close to 2 years before Omaha 10-10-10. And he was on a panel at a conference in New York that I was watching online, and they were discussing what was happening with Twitter, and I used that line, tweeting is reporting, in the context of their conversation. And David had latched on to that because his notion was, with his book and website Be the Media, that the gatekeeping process of journalism was eroding, and as well in business, so that people in the music industry, authors, artists, now could use the technology to go directly to their fans, and that this was going to disrupt. And so, you know, we've had a lot of conversations since then about disruption across a variety of industries. And I think, so that was the context of that moment, that you know, there were moments in live tweeting where somebody was essentially reporting, showing through a photo what they were seeing. And there was an account. Now, it takes crowdsourcing, it takes a lot of traditional journalistic methods to know what you're looking at, but these new forms of communication were popping up at that point.
And I think it's very obvious to anybody who has Twitter accounts or follows even Facebook, subscribes to media on Facebook, that social media are very, very important to news reporting these days. Translate that now into business, advertising, public relations especially.
Well, what I've started to come to in the last 12 months, I would say, is the centrality of what is known as digital content marketing. And by that we mean ideas and practices such as search engine optimization and really solid analytics that can allow us to track literally every click. And this is influencing online conversation across the board, because people who are in business, even people who are nonprofits that we work with at the UNO Social Media Lab, time is a premium, resources are